Sometimes the smallest mistake opens the door to the greatest miracle. At exactly 8:42 on a rainy Tuesday morning, Ethan Carter tightened the worn strap of his faded backpack, while his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, slipped her small hand into his, trusting him with the kind of confidence only children possess. The marble lobby of Whitmore Dynamics shimmered beneath bright morning light pouring through towering glass walls that reflected the gray Manhattan skyline. Expensive shoes crossed polished floors with confident rhythm. Fresh coffee filled the air. Quiet conversations about billion-dollar contracts drifted through the lobby. Yet nobody noticed the father whose work jacket had been carefully repaired more than once, or the little girl smiling beside him as though he owned the entire city. Ethan had accepted an emergency maintenance assignment before sunrise after another technician called in sick. Every extra shift meant groceries for another week, another payment toward rent, another promise kept to his daughter. He unfolded the work order one more time and searched for the correct elevator. The polished signs reflected more light than words. Emma looked up with innocent curiosity. "Daddy, is this the right one?" Ethan smiled with calm confidence despite not being completely certain. "I think it is, sweetheart." The elevator doors opened silently. Neither of them noticed the small brushed steel plaque that read executive access only. They stepped inside together. The doors closed. Outside, two security officers looked toward the rising elevator numbers. One frowned. The other immediately reached for his radio. Did a maintenance contractor just enter the executive elevator? Nearby employees slowly turned their heads. Whispered questions spread across the elegant lobby like ripples across still water. Nobody believed someone dressed like Ethan belonged anywhere near the executive floor. Inside the elevator, Emma watched the illuminated numbers climb higher than she had ever traveled inside a building before. "It feels like we are flying," she whispered with quiet excitement. Ethan laughed softly. Sometimes life lets us see things from higher up. He did not know those simple words would soon carry a meaning neither of them could imagine. The elevator slowed. A gentle chime echoed through the quiet cabin. The doors slid open onto the executive level, where sunlight flooded wide hallways lined with modern artwork and towering windows overlooking Manhattan. At that exact moment, another elevator arrived from the private executive garage. Claire Whitmore stepped forward surrounded by senior executives, board members, and assistants carrying digital tablets filled with the day's schedule. She had negotiated international acquisitions without showing fear. She had faced television cameras, government officials, and skeptical investors with unwavering confidence. Nothing surprised Claire Whitmore anymore. Until now, her eyes settled on Ethan's face. Time seemed to stop. The leather portfolio slipped from her fingers and struck the polished floor with a sharp echo that silenced every conversation nearby. She stared without blinking. Her breathing caught. The color quietly faded from her face as memories she had locked away for nearly 20 years rushed back with overwhelming force. Ethan simply looked at the elegant woman standing before him, completely unaware why the most powerful person in the building suddenly appeared unable to move. Emma gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is everyone looking at us?" Ethan squeezed her hand reassuringly and answered with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through every hardship. "I do not know, sweetheart, but kindness never needs a perfect place to stand." Claire heard every word. Her lips parted slightly as tears threatened to form despite years of discipline that had taught her never to show emotion inside her own headquarters. The executives exchanged confused glances. The security officers stopped walking. The hallway became perfectly still. Only Claire understood why. Because the humble man standing in front of her had disappeared from her life 2 decades earlier after changing it forever. And until this impossible moment, she had believed she would never see his face again. Claire Whitmore did not hear the whispers spreading through the executive floor. She did not notice the anxious executives waiting for instructions or the security officers frozen halfway across the marble hallway. Her entire world had narrowed to one familiar face standing only a few feet away. Ethan Carter, However, had no idea why the woman everyone respected was staring at him as though she had seen a ghost. He simply tightened his gentle grip on Emma's hand and offered a polite smile filled with quiet respect. "I am sorry," he said softly. "I believe my daughter and I took the wrong elevator." His calm voice echoed through the silent corridor. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Every employee expected the billionaire chief executive officer to demand that security escort the maintenance contractor away immediately. Instead, Claire slowly stepped forward. Her blue eyes never left Ethan's face. Emma looked up at her father before quietly asking, "Daddy, is she upset with us?" Ethan leaned down with the same reassuring smile he had worn through every difficult season of life. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes people are simply surprised." Claire heard those words, and another memory tugged gently at her heart. The kindness in his voice had not changed. The patience had not changed. Even after all these years, Ethan still spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who believed respect cost nothing and should be given freely. Claire finally found her voice. "May I ask your name?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Ethan Carter." She closed her eyes for a brief moment. The name completed the memory she had carried for almost 20 years. There was no mistake. It truly was him. Ethan noticed the emotion crossing her face and felt slightly uncomfortable. "Have we met before?" he asked politely. Claire looked at him for several seconds before gently shaking her head. "Not in a way you would remember." The answer confused him even more, but he chose not to press further. Life had taught him that some questions found their answers only after enough time had passed. Emma looked curiously at the elegant woman standing before them. "You look like you want to cry," she said with innocent honesty. Several executives looked horrified by the child's unexpected observation. Claire surprised everyone by smiling warmly. "Perhaps I do," she admitted softly. "Sometimes happy memories arrive when we least expect them." Ethan glanced down at the folded work order still resting in his hand. "I was assigned to repair an air conditioning unit on this floor. If I entered somewhere I should not have, I sincerely apologize. We can wait until someone directs us to the correct place." Claire immediately shook her head. "No, you belong here today." The certainty in her voice left everyone speechless. Even Ethan looked surprised. The chief financial officer quietly stepped closer. "Ms. Whitmore, the board meeting begins in 5 minutes. Without taking her eyes off Ethan, Claire answered calmly, "The meeting can begin without me. I will join you shortly." The executive nodded respectfully, although confusion remained written across his face. Ethan could not understand why one ordinary maintenance assignment had suddenly become so important. He simply smiled with quiet humility. "Your company should not delay its work because of me." Claire looked directly into his eyes and answered with complete sincerity. "Mr. Carter, there are moments in life more valuable than any meeting on my calendar." She then turned toward the hallway, leading deeper into the executive floor. "Would you and your daughter allow me to personally show you to the maintenance office?" Ethan hesitated only for a second before nodding gratefully. "That would be very kind. Thank you." As they began walking together beneath the warm morning sunlight pouring through the towering windows, none of the people surrounding them realized they were witnessing something far greater than an unexpected meeting. They were watching a promise made by fate nearly 2 decades earlier quietly begin to find its way home. Claire Whitmore guided Ethan and Emma through the executive corridor at an unhurried pace, ignoring the curious glances following them from every direction. The polished marble reflected warm ribbons of morning sunlight, while the quiet click of expensive shoes echoed softly behind them. Employees stepped aside without being asked. Some whispered to one another, trying to understand why the woman known for protecting every minute of her schedule had suddenly postponed the most important meeting of the week for an ordinary maintenance contractor. Ethan noticed the attention, but refused to let it change the way he carried himself. He simply adjusted the worn toolbox in his hand and continued walking beside his daughter with the same quiet dignity that had become part of his character long before anyone in this building knew his name. Emma looked through the enormous windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Daddy, the city looks so tiny from up here. Ethan smiled gently. Things only seem smaller when we're looking from far away, sweetheart. Every person down there still matters just as much. Claire heard the words and felt another memory stirring inside her heart. He had always spoken that way, finding gentle truths inside ordinary moments. They arrived at the maintenance office hidden beyond a secure hallway, where polished executive spaces gradually gave way to organized workstations, neatly labeled equipment, and a familiar scent of fresh paint mixed with machine oil. Ethan's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. Rooms like this felt familiar. Honest work always did. The maintenance supervisor hurried over holding a clipboard. Mr. Carter, thank goodness you made it. We have been chasing the same climate control problem for nearly 2 weeks. Ethan accepted the paperwork with a grateful nod. Let me take a look. Without rushing, he placed his toolbox beside the large air handling unit and quietly listened before touching a single tool. The ventilation system produced a faint, uneven hum that most people would never notice. Ethan closed his eyes for several seconds. One technician looked puzzled. Can you actually hear what is wrong? Ethan smiled modestly. Machines usually tell their story if we are patient enough to listen first. Claire remained silent as she watched him work. He never tried to impress anyone. He never announced his experience. He simply observed carefully before making a decision. After removing a small inspection panel, Ethan examined several. Connections, tightened one loose fitting, replaced a worn pressure sensor, and restarted the system. Within moments, the uneven vibration disappeared. The steady hum returned, smooth and balanced. The maintenance supervisor stared at the monitor. That fixed it. We thought the entire control module needed replacing. Ethan wiped his hands with a clean cloth. Sometimes the smallest part creates the biggest problem. Emma smiled proudly at her father without saying a word. Claire noticed the quiet exchange between them and realized success had never been measured inside this family by titles or money. It had always been measured by honesty, patience, and keeping promises. The maintenance supervisor signed the completed work order with visible relief. You probably saved this company thousands of dollars today. Ethan simply shrugged. I'm glad we could repair it instead of replacing something that still had years of life left. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment because she understood he was speaking about far more than machinery. Before anyone could say another word, her assistant entered the room carrying a tablet with visible urgency. Ms. Whitmore, the board has delayed the first presentation, but the directors are asking whether you will be joining them soon. Claire looked toward the conference room down the hallway, then back at Ethan, and quietly realized that the most important decision she would make that morning had nothing to do with the board meeting waiting upstairs. Claire Whitmore accepted the tablet from her assistant without looking at the screen. Her attention remained on Ethan Carter as he carefully organized every wrench and screwdriver inside his worn toolbox before closing the lid with quiet satisfaction. There was something deeply familiar about the way he respected even the smallest details. Years earlier, that same patience had given hope to a frightened young woman who believed her future had already slipped away. The assistant cleared his throat politely. Ms. Whitmore, the board is ready whenever you are. Claire nodded gently. Please let them begin reviewing the agenda. I will join them shortly. The assistant hesitated for a brief moment before leaving the maintenance office. Ethan noticed the interruption and picked up his backpack. I appreciate your kindness, but I should probably get out of your way now. I have another assignment across town before noon. Claire looked at him with quiet determination. Mr. Carter, would you allow me to thank you properly before you leave? Ethan smiled politely. There is really no need. I simply repaired what was broken. Claire answered softly. Some things cannot be measured by the repair itself. Emma looked curiously between the two adults, sensing emotions she could not yet understand. Daddy, I think she still wants to tell you something. Ethan chuckled gently. You might be right. Claire smiled warmly at the little girl before turning back toward Ethan. Would you and Emma join me for an early lunch? There's a private dining room just down the hall. It will only take a little while. Ethan instinctively glanced at the old watch on his wrist. He never liked changing a work schedule, especially when other people depended on him. Seeing his hesitation, Claire spoke again. If your supervisor has concerns, I will personally explain the delay. The maintenance supervisor immediately raised his hand with a friendly grin. Mr. Carter, after saving us from replacing an entire climate system, I think you have earned 30 minutes. Ethan laughed quietly before finally nodding. All right, thank you. The three of them walked together through the executive corridor once more. This time the atmosphere felt different. Employees no longer whispered because a maintenance contractor had entered the executive floor. They whispered because the chief executive officer herself was walking beside him as though he were an honored guest. Emma admired the colorful paintings displayed along the hallway. Daddy, those pictures are beautiful. Ethan slowed his steps to let her enjoy them. Someone spent a long time creating each one. Whenever people make something with care, it deserves our attention. Claire listened silently. Every simple lesson he shared with his daughter reflected the same character she had remembered for almost 20 years. They soon entered a quiet private dining room overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Warm sunlight spilled across polished oak floors while fresh white lilies rested in a crystal vase near the windows. The rich aroma of homemade soup and freshly baked bread drifted gently through the peaceful room. Ethan looked around with humble appreciation. This is a beautiful place. Claire smiled softly. I rarely come here. Ethan looked surprised. It seems like somewhere you would enjoy. Claire slowly shook her head. Beautiful rooms mean very little when important conversations never happen inside them. Ethan sensed the deeper meaning behind her words, but chose not to interrupt. He simply pulled out a chair for Emma before taking his own seat. Claire remained standing for one quiet moment, looking through the glass toward the city below. She took a slow breath, gathered the courage she had carried inside her heart for nearly 2 decades, then turned back toward Ethan with gentle eyes. There's a story I have wanted to tell one person for almost 20 years, she said quietly. Until this morning, I thought I had lost the chance forever. Ethan looked at her with calm curiosity, completely unaware that the ordinary afternoon he expected had quietly become the moment that would finally reveal why fate had brought them together again. Claire remained standing beside the wide glass windows for several quiet seconds while Manhattan stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sunlight. The city moved with its usual urgency, yellow taxis flowing through crowded streets and distant construction cranes reaching toward the sky. Yet inside the private dining room, everything seemed to slow into complete stillness. Ethan sat comfortably beside Emma, without asking a single question. He had learned long ago that people revealed their deepest truths only when they felt ready. Claire finally turned toward them with a faint smile that carried both gratitude and sorrow. 20 years ago, she began softly, I was not the woman you see today. My father had just lost his business. Overnight, my family lost almost everything we owned. I was attending college during the day and working nights because I refused to abandon my education. Ethan listened politely, searching his memory without finding an answer. Claire continued. One rainy afternoon, I was rushing across the engineering campus, carrying a cardboard box filled with textbooks. The bottom tore apart without warning. Every book fell across the sidewalk. People walked around me as though I was invisible. Emma looked at Claire with wide, sympathetic eyes. That must have been lonely. Claire smiled gently. It was. I believed everything in my life was falling apart at the same time. She paused before looking directly at Ethan. Then someone quietly knelt beside me and began picking up every single book without saying a word. Ethan frowned slightly as distant memories stirred somewhere deep inside his mind. Claire continued, speaking with calm emotion. When I apologized for taking his time, he smiled and said, Everyone deserves a little kindness. Sometimes stopping for 5 minutes changes more than continuing to run. Ethan slowly lowered the cup in his hand. The simple sentence echoed through his memory with surprising clarity. Claire noticed the recognition beginning to appear across his face. You also noticed I was crying because I had missed an important scholarship interview. Instead of telling me I was too late, You walked with me nearly half a mile across campus and reminded me that my value would never be measured by arriving a few minutes behind schedule. Ethan stared quietly at the wooden table. Fragments of a forgotten afternoon slowly returned one by one. A rainy sidewalk, scattered textbooks, a frightened young woman trying to hide her tears. I remember someone carrying engineering books, he said almost in a whisper. She looked like she had lost all hope. Claire nodded as tears gently filled her eyes. That young woman was me. Ethan looked up in complete surprise. I never knew your name. Claire smiled through grateful emotion. You never asked. After the interview, I wanted to thank you properly, but you simply wished me good luck and walked away before I could even introduce myself. Ethan laughed softly in disbelief. I thought you earned that scholarship because you were talented. Claire slowly shook her head. I earned it because someone reminded me that one difficult afternoon did not define my future. Silence settled peacefully over the room. Emma looked proudly at her father, smiling as though she had always known he carried quiet stories that even he had forgotten. Ethan finally spoke with gentle humility. Claire, I only try to help someone having a difficult day. She answered with unwavering sincerity. No, Ethan, you help someone believe she still had a future. Without that scholarship, there would have been no university degree, no company, no executive office, and certainly no woman standing in front of you today. I have searched for you ever since because I promised myself that if life ever allowed our paths to cross again, I would finally thank the man who changed everything without asking for anything in return. Claire lowered her eyes for a long moment, allowing the silence to settle gently around the table. The aroma of warm soup and freshly baked bread lingered in the room while soft afternoon sunlight painted golden reflections across the polished wood. Ethan remained perfectly still, absorbing a story he had never imagined would return to him after so many years. Emma quietly reached for her father's hand beneath the table, sensing that something important had just unfolded even if she could not fully understand it. Ethan finally smiled with quiet humility. I'm grateful everything worked out for you, he said sincerely. But you built this company through your own courage. I only happened to be standing in the right place on one difficult afternoon. Claire slowly shook her head. That is exactly what makes you different. She opened the leather portfolio she had carried all morning and carefully removed a small photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. The edges had become slightly worn with time. She placed it gently on the table between them. Ethan leaned forward. The photograph showed two young college students standing outside an engineering building. One was a nervous young woman proudly holding a scholarship letter. Beside her stood a young man wearing a faded backpack, smiling, awkwardly as though he never expected to be included in the picture. Ethan stared at it for several silent seconds before quietly laughing. I remember now. You insisted on taking this photograph. Claire nodded with a grateful smile. Because I believed I would someday have the chance to thank you properly. Ethan looked down again, gently tracing the edge of the old picture with one finger. Life had other plans. Claire answered softly, until today. She then reached into the portfolio once more and placed a second folder on the table. Unlike the photograph, this one contained official company documents. I have another reason for asking you to stay. Ethan looked at the folder but made no move to open it. Claire continued, I would like to offer you the position of Director of Facilities and Engineering Operations for Whitmore Dynamics. The salary, benefits, and schedule would allow you and Emma to build the future you deserve. Emma looked at her father with hopeful excitement before quickly becoming quiet again, waiting for his answer. Ethan remained thoughtful for several moments. Then he slowly closed the folder without reading a single page. Claire looked surprised. Is something wrong? Ethan smiled with the same gentle dignity she remembered from years before. Everything about your offer is generous. He paused before continuing. That is exactly why I cannot accept it this way. Claire blinked in confusion. May I ask why? Ethan folded his hands calmly together. Because gratitude should never become obligation. If I accept this position today, because of something I did 20 years ago, people will believe I earned it through your kindness instead of my ability. I could never ask my daughter to build her future on a lesson like that. The room became wonderfully quiet once again. Emma looked at her father with unmistakable admiration. Claire studied the man sitting across from her and realized that success had never changed her life as deeply as his character had. She slowly smiled, not with disappointment, but with even greater respect than before. "Then I will not ask you to accept gratitude," she said gently. "I will simply wait until life. Give me a chance to prove what I already know." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "And what is that?" Claire's eyes reflected quiet certainty. That every person who truly earns respect eventually finds a place where the world finally notices. Neither of them realized that only a few floors away, an unexpected crisis had already begun inside the company's research division, and within the next hour, it would create exactly the opportunity neither of them had been expecting. Only a few minutes after Claire closed the folder and slipped it back into her portfolio, the peaceful atmosphere inside the dining room was interrupted by a soft but urgent knock at the door. Her assistant entered, trying to remain composed despite the concern visible across his face. "Ms. Whitmore, I am sorry to interrupt, but the research center has reported a major systems failure. The environmental controls inside Laboratory 3 are becoming unstable, and several investors are already on their way for the afternoon demonstration." Claire stood immediately. "Have the engineering teams identified the cause?" The assistant shook his head. "They have been working for nearly 40 minutes. Remote diagnostics keep pointing toward multiple equipment failures, but nothing they replace solves the problem." Ethan quietly reached for his toolbox, intending to leave without saying another word. He understood that emergencies belong to the people responsible for the building, not to a contractor whose work order had already been completed. Claire noticed a movement. "Mr. Carter," she asked gently, "would you be willing to look at the system before you go?" "I'm not asking because of our history. I am asking because I watched how carefully you approached the maintenance unit this morning." Ethan hesitated for only a moment before answering. "If another set of experienced eyes might help, I will gladly take a look." Within minutes, they arrived at the research facility several floors below, where engineers, supervisors, and department directors gathered around large monitoring screens glowing with warning indicators. The room buzzed with anxious conversations while cooling fans echoed through the mechanical space. One engineer explained the situation. "The software keeps identifying electrical faults, but every circuit we replace checks out perfectly. We are running out of time." Ethan listened carefully without interrupting. He looked at the diagrams, then toward the ceiling where steady ventilation sound filled the room. Instead of walking toward the computers, he quietly approached the mechanical equipment itself. He rested one hand against a large insulated pipe and closed his eyes for several seconds. Several engineers exchanged uncertain looks. One quietly whispered, "What is he listening for?" Claire answered before anyone else could. "The same thing he listened for this morning." Ethan slowly opened a small inspection panel and studied the pressure gauges rather than the electronic controls. After another minute, he smiled gently. "Your computers are reporting the symptoms instead of the cause." Everyone looked at him. He continued calmly. "A partially restricted balancing valve is forcing the system to compensate beyond its normal operating range. The software interprets the changes as electrical instability, but the real problem is mechanical." The lead engineer frowned thoughtfully before checking the location Ethan indicated. Seconds later, his expression changed completely. "He is right. A replacement valve was already stored in the maintenance room." Less than 15 minutes later, the entire environmental system returned to normal operation. Warning lights disappeared one after another until every monitor displayed steady green indicators. The tense conversations faded into complete silence. One senior engineer slowly removed his glasses and looked toward Ethan with genuine respect. "We were preparing to replace nearly $200,000 worth of equipment. You solved the problem with one small component." Ethan simply smiled while wiping his hands with a clean cloth. Machines are a lot like people. Sometimes the loudest problem begins with the smallest thing being overlooked. Claire watched every face in the room change from skepticism to admiration. She realized that for the second time in a single day, Ethan had quietly transformed confusion into clarity without asking for recognition. And as the investors entered the research center completely unaware of the crisis that had almost changed their visit, Claire understood that the opportunity she had promised only an hour earlier had finally arrived on its own. The investor presentation began exactly on schedule, and not a single guest realized how close the afternoon had come to unfolding very differently. Bright displays illuminated the research center while advanced technology performed flawlessly. Laboratory demonstrations moved without interruption, and conversations filled the spacious halls with renewed confidence. Claire watched the visitors carefully, but her thoughts remained fixed on the quiet man, standing several steps behind the engineering team with his worn toolbox resting beside his feet. Ethan never stepped forward to explain what he had done. He never asked for recognition. As soon as the system returned to normal, he had simply prepared to leave. That quiet humility impressed Claire more deeply than the repair itself. When the final investor signed the partnership agreement and congratulated the executive team, the room filled with relieved smiles and grateful handshakes. Several directors quietly admitted that the successful demonstration would secure one of the company's most important research partnerships of the year. Claire thanked the guests personally before asking every executive, engineer, and department manager to remain for one final announcement. Curious conversations slowly faded as everyone gathered inside the main conference hall overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The golden afternoon sun reflected across polished glass walls while the city stretched endlessly beyond them. Claire looked toward the doorway, where Ethan stood beside Emma, still expecting to leave quietly without disturbing anyone. "Mr. Carter," she said warmly, "would you and your daughter join us for just one more moment?" Ethan looked surprised but nodded politely. He walked into the room with Emma holding his hand, feeling far more comfortable repairing machinery than standing before dozens of corporate leaders. Claire stepped toward him and faced the assembled employees. "This morning, many of us saw a maintenance contractor carrying an old toolbox," she began calmly. "What we failed to see was a man whose character had already changed lives long before he entered this building." The room became completely silent. Claire continued, "Years ago, when I had almost lost hope in my future, Mr. Carter reminded me that one difficult day does not define an entire life. Today, he quietly reminded all of us that wisdom is not measured by titles, expensive offices, or impressive presentations. It is measured by patience, integrity, and the willingness to serve without expecting applause." Every eye turned toward Ethan. He looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention and smiled modestly. "I appreciate your kindness," he answered softly, "but I only repaired what needed repairing." A gentle laugh moved through the room, followed by respectful applause that grew steadily louder. It was not the applause given to celebrity or authority. It was the sincere recognition reserved for someone who had earned respect through quiet character. Claire waited until the room became still again before placing a new folder on the conference table. "Earlier today, I offered you a position because I felt gratitude," she said. "You refused because you believed opportunities should be earned." After what everyone witnessed this afternoon, our engineering leaders, operations directors, and executive committee all reached the same conclusion independently. They asked me to invite you to apply for a newly approved leadership position through our standard hiring process. Your qualifications, your experience, and your performance today have already earned their recommendation. The decision will follow the same professional standards we expect from every candidate, because that is exactly what you asked for. Ethan looked around the room. Every face reflected respect instead of sympathy. Every expression carried quiet confidence instead of obligation. He finally smiled, not because someone had offered him a shortcut, but because his daughter was watching him receive something far more valuable than wealth. She was watching him receive trust that had been earned honestly. Emma squeezed his hand and whispered with joyful pride, "Daddy, they finally saw what I always knew." Ethan gently squeezed her hand back, realizing that sometimes the greatest reward was never the opportunity itself. It was knowing that character, given enough time, always found its rightful place in the light. Several weeks later, autumn sunlight bathed the Whitmore Dynamics headquarters in warm shades of gold as Ethan Carter stepped through the front entrance once again, not carrying an emergency work order this time, but arriving for the final interview of a hiring process he had completed exactly as every other candidate had. The engineering committee had reviewed his experience, his technical knowledge, his leadership skills, and the recommendations submitted independently by supervisors, senior engineers, and department directors who had witnessed his work firsthand. Every evaluation reached the same conclusion. Ethan had earned their confidence long before anyone realized who he was. When the interview ended, the committee members stood one after another to shake his hand. There were no special favors, no private promises, and no shortcuts. There was only genuine respect. Later that afternoon, Claire welcomed Ethan and Emma into the executive conference room, where the board members waited with warm smiles instead of formal expressions. She placed an official employment letter on the polished table and spoke with quiet sincerity. "Mr. Carter, today you are joining Whitmore Dynamics because your qualifications, your integrity, and your leadership have earned the unanimous confidence of this company. Your story may have brought you to our door, but your character is what opened it." Ethan accepted the letter with grateful humility before looking toward Emma, whose bright smile reflected more pride than any promotion ever could. "I accept," he said softly, "and I promise to lead the same way I have always tried to live, by listening first, serving honestly, and remembering that every person deserves respect." Months passed, and the maintenance division gradually became one of the most admired departments in the company. Employee turnover declined, equipment failures became less frequent, and young technicians often stayed after work simply to learn from Ethan because he never made anyone feel foolish for asking questions. Whenever someone made a mistake, he treated it as an opportunity to teach instead of a reason to criticize. Claire noticed that the culture of the entire organization slowly began to change. Managers listened more carefully. Teams cooperated more willingly. People greeted one another by name instead of title. The greatest transformation inside the company did not begin with a new strategy or a larger budget. It began with one humble father who believed that dignity should never depend on a paycheck. Claire and Ethan also discovered that the strongest relationships are not built through dramatic promises, but through consistent trust. They often shared quiet lunches overlooking the Manhattan skyline, speaking about Emma's dreams, the future of the company, and the surprising ways kindness could travel across decades before returning home. Their friendship slowly deepened into a relationship founded on mutual respect, gratitude, and shared values rather than wealth or status. Emma loved watching them laugh together because, for the first time in many years, she saw her father carrying hope as naturally as he had always carried responsibility. On one peaceful evening, as the setting sun reflected across the glass walls of the headquarters, Claire stood beside Ethan near the same executive elevator where everything had unexpectedly begun. She smiled gently and asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had taken the correct elevator that morning?" Ethan looked at the city glowing beneath the evening sky before quietly smiling back. "Then I probably would have fixed another machine and gone home," he replied. But life has a remarkable way of guiding ordinary people toward extraordinary moments when they continue choosing kindness instead of bitterness. Claire nodded in complete agreement. The elevator doors opened once more, but this time they stepped forward side by side, not as strangers separated by different worlds, but as two people forever connected by one forgotten act of compassion that refused to disappear. Because in the end, the greatest miracles are rarely announced with loud voices or grand celebrations. They arrive quietly, wearing worn jackets, carrying old toolboxes, opening unexpected doors, and reminding us that genuine character always rises higher than wealth, while kindness given freely never truly leaves the world. It simply waits patiently until the right moment to come home.